The philosophy of science is the name of European efforts to prove these myths, to prove that science is the only source of valid knowledge and that all knowledge produced by scientific methods is certain. This project was the basis of a lot of intellectual effort in Europe in the past few centuries, and in the early 20th century the philosophy of logical positivism emerged, which actually succeeded in accomplishing these goals. That is, if we believe logical positivism is true, then we will believe that science is the only source of knowledge and scientific knowledge is certain. Because logical positivism was a philosophy that Europeans had been looking for a long time, they were very happy when it finally was formulated by certain philosophers in Germany, and it became widely popular and widely accepted. Almost everybody in the early 20th century came to believe that logical positivism was true because this is what they had been looking for. Later on, around 50s and 60s, it became clear that logical positivism was wrong. There were many fundamental errors and mistakes, but somehow these mistakes did not actually get corrected. The founder of current economic methodology is Lionel Robbins, and he was deeply influenced by logical positivist ideas, and the basis of modern economic theory was laid down by Robbins on the basis of positivist principles. Even though logical positivism has been proven wrong, it continues to be used. The foundations of economics were never revised. They should have been, because they are based on wrong principles, but it was not done. And similarly, a recent survey showed that economists continue to believe in logical positivist ideas even though these ideas have been proven wrong. So the current methodology of economics is known to be wrong, but there is no alternative. And as we will see, it's not really possible for the Westerns to discover a new methodology, because the correct methodology requires ideas which can only be obtained from Islamic teachings at the current moment. The implications of the nearly universal acceptance of logical positivism were very dramatic, and they continue to be influential to this day. Logical positivism is a philosophy about the nature of human knowledge and the correct methodology for producing human knowledge. Because logical positivism in effect deifies science, in effect it sort of proves that science is the only correct method of knowing the world. So accepting logical positivism led to the idea that the only valid methodology for the production of knowledge is the scientific methodology, and this methodology applies across the board to the production of knowledge in all domains. In particular, it also applies to social science. This, as we shall see, is a big mistake, and in fact it's very easy to see that this is a big mistake. So logical positivism, actually a kind of blindness that was produced by the deification of science. It is a very clear interpretation of the ayah which says that the shayateen are the friends of those who do not believe, and they will lead them from light into darkness. So the ideas of logical positivism drove out many common sense ideas which were present and correct in European understanding of science and social science, but those correct ideas got defeated by the wrong ideas, and the wrong school of thought emerged as victor in many battles that took place in Europe about social science methodology. So there was a battle which is called Methodenstreit in Germany, in which the two methodologies for social science debated with each other, and the correct methodology, which was based on history and experience and more correct ideas, this was lost the battle, and the incorrect methodology, which is based on mathematics and scientific laws, won the battle, and as a result social sciences acquired the wrong methodology. So now, in order to reverse this, and in order to reverse this blindness and to come back to the correct understanding, we first demonstrate that if you just look at the two fields, math and science, where there is no controversy, these two have entirely different methodologies from each other. The methodology of math cannot be applied to science, and the methodology of science cannot be applied to math. So once we understand this, then it becomes easy to understand that different fields can have different methodologies, and each can be valid in its own domain. So it encourages a pluralism about knowledge, which is essential part of human knowledge. The methodology of mathematics is called Hypothetico-Deductive, whereas the methodology of science is the Inductive methodology. These two are entirely different things, and one cannot apply one in the other field. Mathematics was in fact the first rigorous science to be formulated by mankind. The axiomatic methodology was discovered by Pythagoras about 2,500 years ago. It's still being used in our schools and still be studied by scholars all over the world, including the ulama. So the methodology is simple, known to all of you who have studied the postulates of Euclid and the how to derive theorems of geometry. So this is based on axioms and logical deduction, and it does not require any reference to the real world. The axioms and logic are all ideas. When we talk about points and lines, these points and lines are imaginary points and lines. They are not really existing in the real world, because a point is dimensionless and a line is something which has no width. These things don't really exist. We can approximate them in the real world, but these are imaginary objects. So in fact all of mathematics is an imaginary mental construct. It doesn't have any relation to any observation, and this automatically disqualifies it from science, because science must be based on observations. When the Greeks started to study natural science, like Aristotle and Plato and others, they studied the earth and the planets and the growth of the plants and things like that, real phenomena in the real world. It was only natural that they would use the axiomatic method, because that was the only valid scientific method that they knew at that time. So in fact all of these Greek philosophers used the axiomatic methodologies. They started by making certain assumptions which seemed obvious and firm to them, and they used the process of logic to derive conclusions from these in order to learn about the real world. It turns out that this is a big mistake. You can prove almost anything you like, and the Greeks had a lot of mistakes in their theories of natural sciences. because the things that they took to be axioms turned out to be wrong. So, for example, their natural science could prove, Aristotle proved that the earth is the center of the universe, which is simply false. And one of the most interesting examples is there was a controversy among the Greeks about whether when we see objects, whether it is because there is a light which comes out of our eyes and hits the object, or whether the light originates from the object and hits our eyes. So there were two schools of thought. Both of them had axiomatic proofs, and there didn't seem to be any way of deciding between these two. So one of the most dramatic developments was the research of Ibn al-Haytham, who proved that light actually originates from the object and hits the eye and not the other way around. And what was unique about his work was that he used empirical data, observations about the real world, instead of using theory and axioms. This was the beginning of the scientific method, and a historian by the name of Powers has said that the Ibn al-Haytham's work on light was the most remarkable century of discovery of that millennium of the 1,000 years, because basically it laid the ground for the scientific method, which until now had not been considered valid. Up till now, people had been studying science using the axiomatic Hypothetico-Deductive method, but Ibn al-Haytham he proved that using observations could actually decide issues which could not be decided by the axiomatic method. After that, a lot of work was done using the basis of observations to create knowledge, and basically that work turned into modern science. So modern science, the characteristic feature of this is that it is based on observations. But because it is based on observations, it cannot lead to certainty, because logic can lead to a certainty, but the observational data is just what we see, and maybe today we see something but tomorrow we'll see something different. There is no way to prove that what we see today will remain the same tomorrow, and that is really the crucial weakness behind the scientific method. So now what I want to show you is that the method for mathematical discovery, the methodology of mathematics, does not work in science, and that the scientific method does not work in math, and these two are entirely different. So the axiomatic method does lead to certainty, which the scientists are searching for in vain. So once we prove the Pythagorean theorem, we don't need to go out and check by drawing triangles, does it work or doesn't work, because we have proven it logically. You cannot check the Pythagorean theorem by drawing triangles and checking that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. If you do check and you find a mistake, then there will be a mistake in your method. There will be no doubt raised about the Pythagorean theorem. The Pythagorean theorem is true by our mental processes alone. It does not require any reference to the real world. This is very much in contrast to science. Every scientific law must be checked empirically, and every scientific law is capable of being refuted by observations. If we find some observation which is against the scientific law, then we will say that the law is not valid. So science is unlike math. It's fundamentally uncertain. The scientific laws are not subject to proof. They cannot be proven logically. They can only be proved observationally. There are no axioms which are certain. There is no logic of discovery. How we discover scientific laws, it's because an apple hits you on the head, for example. So there is a dramatic difference between science and math methodology. Just like the mathematical method, Hypothetico-Deductive, does not work in science, so the scientific method does not work in math. The process of scientific induction, which basically involves looking for observed regularities and then hypothesizing that these might be universal laws, and then testing or checking them. Although Occasionally such a method is used in maths, but it is rare and exceptional, and it's not the normal process by which mathematical truths are discovered. In the same way, one doesn't confirm mathematical laws by observations, whereas scientific laws are concerned by observations, and scientific laws are not derived by purely mental processes. They require looking and thinking about the real world around us. So there are dramatic differences, but the point that I'm trying to make is that this is more or less obvious, but at the same time the deification of science led the Europeans to ignore or neglect this very important distinction. They confused the scientific methodology with the methodology of mathematics because they thought there is only one correct methodology, and that is the scientific methodology. So they assumed that the mathematical methodology and the scientific methodology are one and the same thing, whereas in fact they are two distinct, entirely different things. And the consequences of this mistake have had a dramatic impact on the current methodology of modern economic theory. Prior to Lionel Robbins, economic methodology was different, and economics was conceived of as the art of using wealth and materials to produce human welfare. After Robbins, this definition was changed to the famous and well-known scarcity definition. I have written a number of papers explaining how this scarcity definition is wrong and is in contradiction with Islamic teachings. The basis of the scarcity definition was this logical positivist understanding of the world. The idea of welfare of human beings is an internal idea. It is an attempt to measure my happiness, my contentment, and this is invisible, and so it's not scientific. So Lionel Robbins moved away from this idea and moved to something which was observable. And one of the things he said was that economic theory is based on logical deduction from postulates which are simple and indisputable facts of experience. This is exactly the definition of the mathematical methodology. We have certain axioms which are certain, and then we use logic to derive conclusions which are also certain. There is no room at any point for any mistakes. An economist who uses the axioms of economic theory and who uses logical deductions, he will always get to the right conclusion, and he will never cross-check with reality. And this is why our modern economic theory never makes any cross-checks with reality, because it's based on the mathematical methodology. We assume that consumers maximize utility because that's rational, and then we derive conclusions from this, and we never go and cross-check to see, do people actually maximize utilities? Do people in fact have such a thing as a utility function? Those people who have explored this, and this question has been explored very deeply by many people today, most of the results are contained in the field of behavioral economics, and this field shows that consumers do not maximize utility. There is very strong and overwhelming empirical evidence which economists disregard and ignore, because a mathematical theory does not need to be confirmed by observations. Just like if I prove the Pythagoras theorem and somebody came and told me that I have drawn a triangle, and in this triangle the sum of the squares of the sides does not equal the square of the hypotenuse, I wouldn't even bother to look at that triangle, because I know that the theorem is correct. And if he has a triangle which doesn't follow it, then he just drew the triangle wrong. Similarly, when people behave in ways that violate utility maximization, the economists say, oh, these people are just not rational. If they became rational, then they would start maximizing utilities, and in the market everybody is rational. So your counterexample is not valid. So a lot of basically economic theory does not check the results against reality. But the people who have checked the results have found that people do not maximize utilities, firms don't maximize profits, and nearly all economic theories which make predictions about the real world are wrong, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in major ways. But this is something which economists don't know because they never bother to cross-check economics with reality because of their use of the wrong methodology, which is the methodology of mathematics. Science got started in the Islamic civilization, and after the decline of the Islamic civilization that was taken over in Europe, why did the methodology of science make tremendous progress, whereas the Greeks failed to make any significant scientific advances? The main reason is because the Greeks were using the wrong methodology. The Greeks were trying to use the methodology of mathematics to develop science, and it was not possible to do so. And it was only following Ibn al-Haytham that science really got started in the Islamic civilization, and there was a tremendous amount of emphasis on observations, and there is a huge number of books and scientific literature belonging to the Islamic civilization. Indeed, the early medieval libraries of European universities were well stocked with Arabic books, because basically all of the scientific knowledge at that time was contained in the Arabic literature. These were all translated into European languages. But the point that I want to make here is that science did not get started until it abandoned the axiomatic methodology of mathematics, which had been the Greek method, and then it started its own methodology. Francis Bacon and others were influential in explaining that the methodology of science is very different from the methodology of mathematics, and one has to look at the real world around us, and from this we find out what kind of scientific theory exists rather than making it up in our own heads. So currently the economic methodology is precisely the same as the mathematical methodology. So the economists are making the same mistake that the Greeks made. This has been made possible because of the ignorance created by logical positivism, that scientific methodology and mathematical methodology are the same. In fact, if you see what would a scientific methodology for economics be, that would involve looking at the consumer to see what they do. That's actually what behavioral economics does, and looking at the firms to see what they are doing, instead of hypothesizing in advance of any observations that consumers maximize profits and consumers maximize utility and firms maximize profits, and never checking to see if this is true. So despite the massive amount of empirical evidence that has now been discovered against economic theories, the same theories continue to be taught in the same way because of this adherence and insistence on a wrong methodology. So am I recommending that we should stop using the mathematical methodology and switch to the scientific methodology for economics? No, I'm not doing that. Even though if I was working within the Western intellectual tradition, this is exactly what I would do, and this is exactly what I would need to do. There is an additional complication that is created by a problem that we are not going to discuss. This problem is that, in fact, what is scientific methodology has also been severely and significantly misunderstood in the West. So there has been a double mistake. The West did not understand what science is because they attempted to make it certain and valid, which it was not. And in order to make it seem like it was certain and valid, they developed an explanation for the methodology of science which was not correct. This incorrect understanding of scientific methodology was then used to construct a methodology for social science. So not only is it true that the social sciences are not using scientific methodology, but scientific methodology itself is misunderstood in the West. This has been explained at great detail in a book by Peter Manikas, which has been the title A History and Philosophy of the Social Sciences. This is not of concern to us because technically what Peter Manikas himself argues is that what we should do is we should replace the wrong understanding of scientific methodology by the right understanding, and then use this right understanding of scientific methodology to construct a methodology for social science. But I am not proposing that either. I am saying that even the correct scientific methodology will not be helpful in social science, and that's why it's not correct to use the word social science, because when we study human beings, we simply cannot apply methods of physical sciences. So just like mathematics and physics have different methodologies, so physical sciences and humanities have different methodologies. So this is the issue to which we will now turn. So I would like to argue that there are three separate methodologies. One is axiomatic deductive methodology, which is suitable for math. There is an inductive methodology which is suitable for science, and there is an entirely separate third methodology which I will discuss later, which is suitable for humanities. None of the three can be interchanged. One very simple and rather amusing example to show that scientific methodology is not suitable for humanities is that a large number of Nobel Prize winners of sciences have had rather bitter divorces. Einstein was divorced from his first wife, and he did not know how to be a good husband to his wife, and he did not know how to be a good father to his children. Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner in economics, has been divorced twice. Lucas, he divorced his wife, and these are just some famous names that everybody knows, but there are large numbers. So basically what I'm saying is that having maximum expertise in the physical sciences does not guarantee anything about your knowledge of the humanities. So similarly, the methodology of science cannot actually be used to construct good, valid methodology for the social sciences. The key difference that will be important for us is that the normative statement makes no sense in science. In science, we look at the world and we try to discover what is there. We cannot wish that, oh, I wish that the world is there is warming taking place. I wish that it was not taking place. We just look at what the facts are and we try to describe them, and that is if there is a physical law, that's what it is. We cannot change it. We cannot wish that it was different. So the normative statement is not of much use in scientific theory. However, just as it doesn't make any sense to say that gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared, but it should be 15 meters per second squared. But it does make sense to say that human beings are often greedy and selfish, but they should be generous and kind. Now, what the adoption of the physical science methodology in humanities did was they said that normative statements make no sense. So the second statement, that human beings should be generous and kind, they should be compassionate, they should be cooperative. All of these sentences are meaningless statements. They are nonsense. We should just look at what people are like, and we should just describe it. We should not bother to say things like people should behave well. Now this is wrong. This idea that the normative is meaningless is perfectly correct when it goes to physical science, and is completely wrong when it applies to human beings. Unfortunately, not making a distinction between the two, the Western scientists thought that just like the normative is meaningless in physical science, so it is also meaningless for human beings. So for them, for the Western scientists, it makes no sense to say that there are a lot of poor people on the planet and this is unacceptable injustice and we should try to remove it and we should try to feed the poor. They say that these are fine human sentiments, but they are not part of science. Now what I would like to say is that that is a wrong understanding of what humanities is about and how it should be done. So the methodology that I propose as being the correct one for humanities is to first define what an ideal state of affairs would be, what is the best possible, and this is exactly what Islam does. It prescribes what is the best possible behavior, even though it's not real, it's not realized. The best possible behavior for us is that one which was modeled by our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it is an ideal, and it is a kind of perfection that we cannot hope to achieve, but it is still a valid goal for our efforts. So the first step is to describe an ideal, which is directly a normative step. The second step is to study the differences between our present position, the reality, the empirical, the observational, and the ideal. And the third step is to work to remove these differences. We find that the reality or the empirical behavior of people is not according to the one recommended by our religion and not the one that was demonstrated by our Prophet. And so we work on methods which will teach people how to behave better, how to go closer to the ideal. In fact, this methodology is actually currently in use in the West, but without explicit acknowledgement. That is, this is in fact what they do. They describe an ideal and then they work to achieve that ideal, but they never actually explain that this is what they do, and they do not in fact understand that this is what they are doing, because this is not a scientific method, and they like to pretend to themselves that they are using the scientific method. So they have a deep misunderstanding. What they say is the methodology of science is very different from what actually is the methodology of social science. The economic theory works by describing an ideal state. The ideal state is one of perfect competition. All human beings are selfish and greedy, and they work to rationally to maximize their benefits, and similarly all the firms are profit maximizers, and there is cutthroat competition among them, and this creates efficiency. All of these are ideals. None of these are actually true in the real world. Everybody acknowledges that the perfect competition and the perfectly free markets do not exist anywhere, have never existed, and could never exist, because the assumptions required for the perfect free markets are simply impossible to hold. The transaction cost must be zero, there must be no externalities, information must be freely available to all, and many others which are simply not true. They do not hold in the real world. So nonetheless, the economists describe this as an ideal state, and then they say, okay, now let's see how can we change the reality in order to achieve this ideal state. Now their ideal state is really one which is very horrible. I mean, would you like to live in a world in which every human being is selfish and greedy and doesn't care anything about others, and where all the firms are trying to maximize their own profits? They have no inclination towards service. All of these are very ridiculous and unappealing ideals. As opposed to this, Islam offers a world in which cooperation among people, generosity, responsibility for others, taking care of the weak, justice, all of these are ideals. They may not be realized, but our goal as Muslims is to try to bring about a world, try to change the world, to invite towards the good and to try to prevent the evil. These are our goals as Muslim economists, and our methodology must match these goals. The crucial difference between a scientific methodology and a methodology for humanities is that scientific methodology does not try to change things. It tries to observe the world as it is and describe it. As opposed to this, a methodology for humanities tries to change behavior. Science cannot ask how man should behave or how physical laws should be. Freedom, which is a property of humans, cannot be handled by science. On the other hand, essential characteristic of human beings is that they have freedom. The Quran says that we have shown human beings the two highways of good and evil, and the Quran offers many times the idea that human beings are free to choose. Let whoever wants to, let him believe, and whoever wants to, let him reject. So with this freedom then, there are no laws of motion such as those which exist in science, and also history cannot be used to forecast the future. If a human being has been behaving in a certain way, he can choose to change. This is not an option available to scientific particles who are forced to follow deterministic laws. And because of this crucial difference, the methodology that we have proposed is one which accounts for the freedom, whereas scientific methodology cannot possibly do so. And that's why methodology for humanities must involve the normative element, because if we want to change things, we must know what is the direction in which to change them, which direction is good, what kind of changes are good to make and what kind of changes are bad. Without knowing this, there is no way to create change which is positive. Many people in the West have critiqued social science, its methodology, and they have proposed alternatives. But what I am trying to say here is that it is impossible for the West to develop an alternative of the kind that I am proposing, because basically there is no secular basis for morals. So the normative is unscientific, because secular people cannot construct morals, and so the methodology that I am proposing is unique to Muslims. Only Muslims can develop and use this methodology. Secular Western people cannot, and this is one reason why this methodology has not been developed so far, because the Muslims for the most part have been trying to imitate Western methodology, and Western methodology is incapable of developing these ideas. The normative, there are two bases which are currently in use for developing normative statements in the West. One of them is consensus. If everybody agrees that this is good behavior, then that is the normative, that is a normative statement. So, but the consensus base does not provide a stable basis. A very simple example is that in the 1970s, homosexuality was a crime. It was against the law. It was listed in the psychological book of diseases, and it was considered a bad behavior universally, socially. I mean, it was not acceptable in society. In the 1990s, the consensus changed dramatically. Now, homosexuality was taken off the list of psychological diseases. It's now considered normal behavior. Homosexual marriage became the issue, and gay rights became the issue, and in fact to speak against homosexuality became a crime. So there was a 180-degree shift. The consensus was something, and it became exactly the opposite. So this doesn't provide any stable basis for morals. It means that anything you want to can be moral, and so how can you in such a situation have a normative statement except temporarily and locally? The second basis that has been proposed in the West for discovering morals is called utilitarianism. It means that anything that makes you happy is good. Now there are some very serious problems with this approach. One of them is that there is a conflict between the short term and the long term. So for example, taking drugs might make you happy in the short run, but it will cause unhappiness to you in the long run. So this creates a conflict. Which kind of behavior should we consider as good if that's the only basis? Furthermore, Allah Ta'ala says clearly in the Quran that you may like something and it may be bad for you, and you may dislike something and it may be good for you. So the idea that we should just do whatever we like is not going to be generating good social outcomes. So apart from the short term and the long term conflict, there is also another conflict that occurs between social interest and individual interest. In many cases it would be privately beneficial to an individual, it would increase his happiness to do something, but it would cause damage to society. Now then, should we consider the individual behavior as the norm and the social behavior? Should we consider social benefit or individual benefit? There has been a dramatic change in the West in this idea. Initially it was thought that human beings should sacrifice their individual self-interest for the benefit of society, but now this idea has changed completely, and now the normative idea is that every individual should freely follow his own self-interest even if it damages society. So this is what accounts for the current complete breakdown of society, complete breakdown of family, high divorce rates. Everybody is following their self-interests without taking care about his near and dear ones. The children don't care if the parents are abandoned in their old age. The parents don't care about their children because they know that they are not going to care about them in their time of need. The husband doesn't look after the wife doesn't feel responsible for the husband. So there is everyone is looking out only for his own self-interest, and this has led to a basic breakdown in society. Similarly, in trying to construct morality on the basis of science, we find that science does not offer us any guidance. There is no scientific way to prove that lying is wrong, that one should not cheat on one's wife, that murder is wrong, that bombing is wrong. If we just act empirically, if we observe, then basically we get to the position which was espoused by Machiavelli, that you should just do what is beneficial without any regard for morals. You should cheat, you should be ruthless, you should crush your enemies in such a horrible way that they should not dare to rise. It is on the basis of this kind of rational consideration, which does not take into account any morality, that the Holocaust, in which millions of Jews were burned in ovens, including women and children, this was on the basis of denial of morality. And similarly, today, not too long ago, the American Secretary of State announced on public TV that it was worth sacrificing the lives of 500,000 Iraqi children in order to achieve US political goals in that area. So when you look at a scientific and empirical analysis, then there is no morality. It's all a matter of convenience. You can kill and murder and rape if it happens to be beneficial to you. So basically, only Islam can offer us a methodology in which there is an absolute basis for morals, and that can be used in order to create this methodology which I am proposing. This methodology is not available for a European secular audience. So this methodology of clearly describing an ideal state and then working to achieve it is only available to Muslims. Now this methodology was actually demonstrated in practice by our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who took the Arabs who were at the bottom of the civilization at the time of Jahiliyyah. They were ignorant and savage in nearly all measures of civilization. The Egyptians and the Romans and the Persians and the Chinese, these were all advanced civilizations compared to the Arabs, and they had technology, they had literature, they had philosophy, they had martial arts, and the Arabs had nothing. However, application of the methodology of describing the most excellent behavior and then working to change people so as to achieve this excellence, this created the greatest evolution in the human history. It took the Arabs from the bottom to the top in civilizational ranking. It created a permanent change which lasted for centuries, and it created the most advanced civilization that has ever been seen on this planet. If you look at the current claimants to this title, the people who claim to be the most civilized, and you look at their behavior, how they have been killing and murdering and torturing innocents in their own prisons for no reason. Currently in Guantanamo Bay, more than 100, the conditions are so bad that the majority of the prisoners want to commit suicide, and the vast majority of them have not been charged with any crimes. They are innocent. Islam teaches us that a person is innocent until proven guilty, but there the people are guilty even after they have been proven innocent. So these people cannot compare to the civilization that was created by Islam, although it is true that it is now just a memory. In the current social matrix, the Muslims have nothing or very little that remains of Islamic teachings that is in practice in Muslim lives today. This is according to the prophecy that was made by the Prophet, that Islam came as a stranger and it will become a stranger. So if we think of Islam not as a collection of teachings but as a way of life, then indeed Islam is a stranger to the Muslims in nearly all departments of their life, whether it's politics, whether it is governance, whether it is education, whether it is justice, whether it is social affairs. In all of these dimensions of our lives, we are following the ways of the West, and we are not following the teachings of Islam, which have a unique and distinctive system in all of these dimensions. I have discussed this elsewhere in some of my other papers. So I'd like to conclude this lecture by saying that the Islamic methodology that I am proposing is the same methodology that has been given to us by Allah. Allah Ta'ala says that you are the best of the communities and you have been brought about for the good of mankind, and you tell them to what is right and you create the changes that are necessary to bring this about, and you prohibit what is evil. So this involves both words and action, that we try to invite people towards the good, and we try to do make the changes necessary to bring about the good. This is exactly the methodology that I am proposing, that we look at the good and the bad in the world, and we see that the world is not like that, so we invite and we make the necessary effort to bring about the change. And this is the proposed methodology for Islamic economics, which is based directly on Islamic principles. And this methodology, when applied, is an extremely powerful methodology, as was demonstrated by our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and has been demonstrated by many Muslim reformers all over the world. There have been many times when the Ummah has been in decline, and reformers have been sent by Allah, and they have created changes which have again brought spirit and life into the Ummah. And it has been promised that every century Allah Ta'ala will send us some new reformers who will bring about this regeneration. So this is exactly what we need, and Allah Ta'ala has promised us to reward these efforts, and He has said that وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. So if we make the struggle to change the world for the sake of the pleasure of Allah, this will always be rewarded. Allah Ta'ala will always guide us to our ways. Currently we are not making the effort properly, and we are not making the effort with the proper niyat, and we are following the wrong methodologies and wrong concepts acquired from the West, and that is why we are going astray. If we refocus and we concentrate on the pure teachings of Islam, and we realize that the guidance from Allah is perfect and complete, this will be the best way to solve the current problems facing the Ummah. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.